As we noted earlier, we have a very, very interesting panel with us today. The title of it is New Economic Thinking, Inequality, and the Role of Trade Unions in all of that. With us today, we have Professor James Galbraith. Jamie holds the Lloyd M. Benson Jr. Chair of Government and Business Relations at the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. His most recent book is The End of Normal. And the next one, that'll be out very soon, is What Everyone Needs to Know About Inequality. That'll be out very, very soon. We also have with us Veronica Nilsson. She's the Confederal Secretary of the European Trade Union Confederation in Brussels. And we understand will become Deputy General Secretary after the ETUC Congress in September, and we offer you an early congratulations on that. Veronica formerly worked as a senior policy advisor at TUAC and an economist at the TCO in Sweden. What we thought we'd do is have Professor Galbraith make a presentation, and then Veronica would make a presentation, and then we'll open up and have a discussion with each one of them. I think you'll find it most informative and most delightful. Jamie, why don't you go forward?
There you
go.
Let's see. There we go. Thanks very much indeed, and it's great to be here. And to mes camarades français, françaises, canadiennes, bonjour. I thank you also, Rich, for that advertisement for the inequality, what everyone needs to know. It's particularly timely since I sent it off to the publisher this morning. Yeah. I thought today I would focus my remarks specifically on the European situation, and particularly because over the last 4 months I have been preoccupied with and to a certain degree closely associated with the negotiations concerning the relationship between the European institutions and Greece. But before turning to that specific situation, let me just stipulate what a reasonable policy in the European context might look like. I can do that, I think, because I was able to participate in drafting one. It's called The Modest Proposal, co-authored by myself, by Stuart Holland, former Labour Member of Parliament, now professor in Portugal at Coimbra, and Yanis Varoufakis, whose name you may have heard recently. That proposal sought to operate entirely within the framework of existing European treaties and charters, and that's in respect of which it is actually a modest proposal. It's an effort, in other words, to set out a realistic, not an overly ambitious, but a realistic framework for a change of European policy in a more progressive and more successful direction. And it had 4 elements. The first was an initiative to deal with what are plainly unpayable and unsustainable debts, a problem that will have to be dealt with at some point. And our idea was to mutualize those debts through the institutional framework of the European Central Bank to make the Maastricht compliant portion for participating states, the first 60%, essentially financeable at the rates and on the terms that are available to the European Central Bank. This would make it much easier, of course, to finance the rest. The second was an investment initiative, the framework for what might be called a New Deal for Europe that would use the existing institutions, the European Investment Bank, European Investment Fund, to begin a much-needed program of new construction, reconstruction, environmental investment, social investment, and employment for all of Europe, but especially for those regions which have been so strongly affected in the last 5 years by the European crisis. It occurred to us more recently that these two initiatives could be to some degree combined, since the European Central Bank is launching a program of quantitative easing, that the bonds of the European Investment Bank could become the vehicle for such a program, that the ECB could buy those bonds, and that would enable the EIB to ramp up its operations to a much larger scale than it has presently or in the past without infringing on its creditworthiness. So again, practical, reasonable proposals to change the direction of the broader line of policy in Europe. The third element was a case-by-case resolution at the European level of insolvent or failing banks, with the idea being that part of the problem in the European setting has been the, I think, undeniably toxic relationship between large banks and governments, and that dealing with this problem should be something that is done at the European level, but that should not require all of the immobilism that's associated with the current proposals for a banking union. And the fourth element is a solidarity program, a program which would have extended to the vulnerable populations, to the troubled populations, to the unemployed populations, to the hungry populations in parts of Europe, a helping hand that could be financed at the European scale using the resources of the Target 2 mechanism. And the idea there is drawing on the historic experience of the United States and other large federations that part of the purchasing power of the society has to be provided on a common basis through a common social insurance fund, and that this is not only necessary or useful for humanitarian purposes, but an extremely important way to stabilize all of the regions, in the European case, all of the countries, against the worst consequences of a harsh economic environment. So that was our program. It was circulating for a number of years, and you will notice that it is on nobody's agenda, that it is simply not part of the framework of current discussion. Yeah, well, there we are. So what is on the agenda is something much narrower, far more modest still, and that is the issues that are under discussion between the recently elected government of Greece and its European partners. The government of Greece is in a distinctive position of having basically put onto the agenda a set of variances or changes from the standard menu of policies, austerity policies, economic so-called liberalization policies, and so forth, that have been the universal fare of European policymaking, at least since the start of the crisis, and whose ideological origins go back a good deal longer than that. The government of Greece has accepted a fairly large part of the agenda of the institutions and of the prior regimes with respect to public administration and changes in the structure of taxation. Some of those are non-controversial, some of them are with reservations. But there are a number of elements which the government of Greece has not accepted, and because of its both reasoned positions and political commitments, is not going to accept. So there are four of those, and I think I should just take a moment and go over them, because even though I'm sure that you are familiar with them in broad terms. The first is that the government should be committed to macroeconomic targets with respect to a primary surplus that are reasonable and achievable, and that will not keep the economy, or at least have a chance of releasing the Greek economy from a state of permanent depression, an ongoing decline. It is not prepared to sign on to macroeconomic targets that it cannot achieve, and which, if it attempted to achieve, would produce a further destruction of the Greek economy and of the Greek social economy, which has already lost, as I'm sure you know, about 30% of its output, of its annual output over the last 5 years. So that is a first so-called red line, and one which is, I think, incontestably reasonable, given the experience of 5 years of decline when recovery was always being predicted and always just around the corner. The second broad line of variance, it has to do with pensions. And the Greek government is not prepared to accept a reduction in pensions to people who are already quite poor. 44% of pension owners, pension receivers in Greece are already below the poverty line, receive very modest benefits. And the Greek government's position is that the unsustainability of finances in the pension system, which is the argument for further reductions, is the result of the poor economic performance, and therefore of the shortfall in tax revenues and pension contributions, and that curing the poor economic performance is the right approach to the pension system and the only civilized approach given the stresses that have already being felt by pensioners in Greece. And the third proposition has to do with labor standards and with collective bargaining, in which it's fair to say, I think, that Greeks have been subjected to what amounts to an unethical experiment, an experiment for which you could not get approval if you were an academic researcher going before your institutional review board. I look over at my academic colleague, Professor Spriggs, and he can explain it to you later. But basically, when you're working with human subjects, you need to be doing things which are not risking grave harm. And what the Greeks have been asked to do and what they have done in their labor markets has inflicted great harm on the working population of Greece without producing improvement in exports, gains in jobs that were in some abstract but completely unrealistic theory supposed to result. Instead, what has concretely happened on the ground in Greece is a vast increase in the informalization of the labor market, so that people who were previously working or who might otherwise be working in the formal sector are being paid, if they're working at all, off the books in cash, not contributing to the pension system, and therefore aggravating the fiscal problems of the state. What the Greek government has requested instead is that the international standards that apply elsewhere in Europe, and indeed normally elsewhere in the world, the standards of the ILO, be applied in Greece. That's the third red line of the government. And the fourth one has to do with privatizations, where the position of the government, I think, would not meet argument from any moderately well-trained economist, or for that matter, any business person. And it is simply that if you put everything on the auction block at once, you're very unlikely to get an acceptable price. That's what's called a fire sale. And the evidence that that is a correct position is very strong because, in fact, many things have gone on the auction block and the revenue resulting has been very small in relation to what was expected or predicted. So the argument in, let's say, broad logical terms and on the basis of evidence, that is to say, the argument on the merits for these positions is essentially incontestable. But although these issues are on the table, and the novelty is that there is an actual discussion, or at least the framework of a negotiation, there is no sign of acquiescence in reasoned argument. Instead, what you read in the papers, following every session and every meeting of the Eurogroup of the finance ministers, is that the Greeks are being told to stop stalling, to get on with it, to move faster, as though the presentation of their negotiating position cannot possibly be serious, cannot possibly be something that is actually to be discussed or responded to, but must be merely the necessary political theater for the home audience before the government becomes realistic and agrees to the terms as specified for the other side. Now, why is this? I think the answer to that is that it's very clearly not a question of economic policy argument, but a question of power, and that in the context that we see in Europe, the power has passed into the hands of institutions and into the hands of economists who are a, let's say, mutually reinforcing tribe who set the policy of those institutions, who have been brought up in a certain tradition over the past generation, which is the mainstream tradition in economics, and who are not judged, even crudely, by the results of their policies. These are not like generals who lose battles or naval officers who run their ships aground or political leaders who face elections. These are people who are judged by their peers in a rather strict hierarchy of perceived intelligence and merit, and the judgment is therefore based on their conformity to the previously established ideas and on nothing else. And in that situation, when things do not go according to plan, there are always three reasons that can be invoked. One is that, well, initial conditions were worse than expected, so nobody could have foreseen how badly things were going to turn out. The second one is that the policies, while not wrong, were not applied with sufficient zeal, and therefore what is needed is more of the same. And the third is, well, wait a minute, it's going to be all right. The forecast says recovery is going to start in 3 or 6 months' time. Right? And some combination of those three, it's very hard to make an argument against three positions at once. That's probably why Caesar divided Gaul into three parts. Some part of those propositions always holds up in the public sphere, or at least gets past the even modestly critical ear of the mainstream press. And therefore, anyone who challenges them and challenges the rationalizations behind them, as the Greek government has been doing, and has been doing with a great deal of eloquence and coherence. I don't know if you saw the article of Prime Minister Tsipras in the Huffington Post 2 days, or yesterday, I guess, at least in the French edition. It's a nice example of the clarity of their position. But anybody who takes these positions is to be dismissed on grounds of character or other personal defects. I mean, it's an old story. We could tell the same story, those of us who've been in American politics, could tell the same story about American institutions and about the way in which, let's say, the Congressional Budget Office influences and distorts the policymaking process in the United States. But this is the situation that we face, it seems to me, if we want to press for a more progressive set of policies. We need first to frame what they are, and then to focus on the political battles that are required to create the powerful enough institutional frameworks for making those changes occur. In the European context, it seems to me, this is the judgment that has already been reached by the Greek government, which is that there must be a political solution. Whether there will be a political solution in time to prevent dramatic events in the next 6 weeks is a very interesting question to which no one that I know has a definitive answer. But it will either happen in the next 6 weeks with respect to the position of the Greek government, or it will happen some months later when some other country decides or is pressed by its electorate to move into a similar position of refusal to cooperate with what are plainly failed policies. That country might be Spain, might be Portugal, might be Ireland, might be Italy, might be France. But it will happen. If it doesn't happen in Greece, it will happen somewhere else. So the problem is not going to go away. And if it is not dealt with within the framework of the existing European institutions, which is what the Greek government hopes for, And what Yanis and Stuart and I basically constrained ourselves to argue for in writing the modest proposal, then it will happen as the result of significant changes in the structure of European economic governing institutions. And those significant changes will be disruptive, but they will be basically impossible to avoid at some point, because after all, debts that cannot be paid will not be paid, conditions that cannot be agreed to will not be agreed to, things that must change will eventually change. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Excellent. Veronica?
Thank you very much. And I thought the presentation from Professor Galbraith was really, really interesting, and I very much like your idea of a modest proposal. You said that, unfortunately, this modest proposal is not on the table. And so why is this? And I'd like to start with the European Commission, because I think what you just said is really well described by their most recent economic forecast, which was published, I'm not sure, a few weeks ago or something like that. Because what they say in this forecast is that the labor market situation is improving due to structural reforms. And they say also that the employment growth is in Europe, in EU, is driven by employment growth in the south, which is due to the structural reforms that have been carried out there. And I think we have our colleagues from Spain and Italy, and I think you know the situation better than I do, but the reforms that have been carried out have really focused on reducing employment protection, cutting wages, trying to undermine collective bargaining institutions, decentralizing collective bargaining so it will take place at the local level. There's also been a number of reforms so that full-time jobs have been split into smaller contracts, or for example, a few hours and things like that. And that is what the Commission is seeing as something successful. So the Commission really has three ideas to improve the economic situation and to what they say make the economy or the recovery sustainable. And they go much further than the OECD. I noted also what Roland said this morning, that at least the OECD there is recognition that there are some adverse effects of these structural reforms as well, and that does not seem to be the case for the European Commission. So what the Commission is proposing is, first of all, structural reform. Secondly, they want to have more austerity. They don't call it austerity, they call it financial responsibility. But for us, it's really the same as austerity. And these are exactly the two things that EU has suffered from for several years now during the crisis, structural reforms and austerity. Then the third measure, finally, something that we can agree with the Commission on, so that's very positive. They are calling for more investment. This is something we really welcome. But they're calling for investment, but only those member states which have the fiscal space to invest. The others, they should continue debt consolidation. So you see investment, yes, but it's limited to those countries they consider have the economic space to do so. So I think this is really of great concern to us. How can we change this? I think there has already been a little bit of a change in the well, I don't know the thinking of the Commission, but since we have a new Commission since the end of last year, there is now more focus on investment, and recognition is perhaps going too far, but there is at least more questioning of austerity. But yet, when you read this forecast, you have the same as before, austerity and structural reform. But I think, why is this the case? Well, I think it's quite simple, really. We now have a common currency in the euro area, and we cannot devaluate our currency anymore. So this currency tool has really been replaced by internal devaluation, which means that all the adjustment is taking place through wage cuts or wage moderation and structural reforms. And also member states have very limited possibilities to really carry out an economic policy that deviates from what have been decided at the EU level. As you referred also to the Stability and Growth Pact. We have the Fiscal Compact, which introduced a new criteria, which says that the structural deficit mustn't be larger than 0.5%. Now, first of all, how do you measure this structural deficit? That's one thing. But the other thing is, if you only can have 0.5% structural deficit, you don't really have much space in your budget to invest, and so on. So I think these are a number of things that we want to change as the ETUC. And I would like to say a few words about what we are doing now. We have our Congress coming up. It will start on the 29th of September, and it will take place here in Paris. And we are working on the Congress preparations, our policies for the coming 4 years. And I think we will continue to focus on creating growth and employment, which has been our priority the last few years. We haven't been that successful in achieving growth and employment, although it looks a bit brighter now that at least there is positive growth and there is unemployment has come down, not a lot, but at least it's going in the right direction. So instead of increasing, it is decreasing. So these will be issues to focus on, and we will make a number of proposals to stimulate the economy, to have a stronger economy in the EU. And so I would like to share with you a few of those ideas that we are discussing now in our Congress Preparatory Committee. I think the first thing is really wages. Because workers in Europe need a pay rise. And here I think we can look at the TUC, who has actually been quite successful in that campaign for a general pay rise. And that's something that we should do at the European level as well. Today, growth is driven by private consumption, but it's a fragile growth. And workers don't really have much of the increase in wages in real terms have been very, very low, and cuts then in a number of countries. So this is something that we need to change. We are calling for a wage-led recovery, and we must make governments better understand that it's necessary to stimulate demand. The second issue, as you have also mentioned, is investment. You probably know that the ETUC adopted an investment plan maybe 2 years ago, where we said that we need investment for about 2% of GDP every year during a 10-year period. And according to the economists that made the calculation, they said that that could create 11 million new jobs, which is greatly needed in the EU. Now, we do have a proposal from the new Commission for an investment plan. It's far smaller than our investment plan. It's not so ambitious, but at least it's a step in the right direction, and that is very welcome. It's a plan which the Commission says would get 315 billion euros for investment. It's not so clear how they actually arrive at this figure, because it's, in terms of new money, it's very, very little. The idea is that this will accumulate money, so we'll see. Yeah. But it's a step in the right direction, and the European Parliament, together with the Commission and the Council last week, they now agreed on how to do this. They have agreed to set up this fund, this new fund, which is called European Fund for Strategic Investment, who will be responsible for channeling these investments to where they are needed. But that is also one of the question marks, because how can we make sure that this investment will really be new, additional investment, so it doesn't replace investment that would have taken place anyway? And the other problem is, how do you make sure that they will invest in the countries which most need this investment? Will they invest in the south? Will they really invest in Greece? And that is something that we have been emphasizing quite a lot. And we have therefore asked that the social partners should be consulted over the selection of projects, so that we can be part of this process as well. And then third issue is revision of economic governance. We believe that the economic governance which exists today is focusing far too much on price stability, on cutting deficits, cutting public debt, and on cost competitiveness. We believe that member states need more time to get their budgets in order. They cannot do it as quickly as as has been demanded. And we also need a revision of the Growth and Stability Pact, because there are a number of criteria which are quite hard to fulfill. And as I mentioned before, the structural deficit of 0.5%. We have also asked for the introduction of a kind of a golden rule, which would allow governments to not to calculate all the investment as debt. So productive investment should not be calculated as debt. However, what the final definition of this investment would be, I cannot say, because it's one of the issues where we have some disagreement among ETUC affiliates. So I think it will be our Congress that will make the final decision on this one. But the principle is very important, because productive investment should not be considered as debt. It should be exempted from the calculation of the public debt. Another problem with the Commission economic governance is that they always focus on the member states. So they don't look at what the policies will mean for the whole of the EU area. It's always about the individual countries. So if you look at the country-specific recommendations, if they, for example, give recommendations to one country that the wages are too high, then yes, if wages would come down, you can then deduct that they would be more competitive compared to neighboring countries. But what will be the overall result for the EU area of this kind of policies? Well, it will be a downward spiral, which will depress the economy. But that is not something that the Commission is really looking at. It's just looking at the recommendations to each country instead of seeing what the overall consequences will be for the EU area. We would also like to see that there is a social dimension of this economic governance, because it's all about the economic criteria and not on the social dimension. The Commission should always respect fundamental social rights, and we don't believe this has been the case when they have acted as part of the Troika together with the European Central Bank and the IMF. And this is something that has to change for the future, because it's written in the treaties that the EU institutions, so the ECB is included, that they should always respect fundamental rights. And I don't think this is the case for Greece and for some other countries as well. And there has been a number of legal complaints against member states, for example, in Greece, but they have not really been so successful for many reasons. And even where the Greek trade unions have been successful, there has been no implementation. So even if they have gone to court and they have won in court, there hasn't been any implementation, and that is also a problem. We would also like to see better indicators, because the indicators the Commission is using, they are not focusing on some important issues such as low-wage jobs, precarious jobs, and they do not take into account profits, for example. And as we also have heard before, that the share of profits is just going up. This is not being invested, and yet this is not something that the Commission is keeping track on. It's not part of their indicators, and it should be, because that is also important. And I would also like to mention in the context of economic governance, the work that is being done right now. There is this document called the Four Presidents document, which will be discussed by the European Council at the end of June. And we're quite worried because the Commission will take further steps to, improve the way they improve economic governance. And from what we have seen so far, I think is a little bit honest is perhaps not the best word, but the way they describe the reasons of the crisis is not something that we would agree with. For example, they say that it's the non-respect of the economic criteria of the Stability and Growth Pact, together with rigid labor and product markets, that are the cause of the crisis. And I think that is not the way that we see the world. I think the crisis has been much more complicated than this. And if you look at the figures, I don't think they really correspond to what the Commission or what these four presidents claims. Because first of all, the euro area deficit was very low when the crisis started. It was only 0.6%. So it wasn't high. It was actually within the frame of the rules of the Stability and Growth Pact. And if we particularly look at Ireland, which was one of the bailout countries, Ireland had, at the time of the crisis, they had a 3% budget surplus. They didn't even have a deficit. They had a big surplus, 3% surplus. And if you look at their public debt, the public debt stood at 27% of GDP, which again is very, very low and far lower than the criteria, which is 120%. Now, after the crisis, after the measures that were introduced, the Irish debt has jumped and is now at 114% of GDP. So it has increased from 27 to 114% during this crisis. So I think it says quite a lot about the real reasons for the crisis, and that the solution is not austerity. This is what happened because of austerity. And then perhaps just the last point is the European Central Bank, because I think also the role of the European Central Bank needs to change. First of all, we would like to see an ECB that is more like the US Federal Reserve, which also targets employment, which has as a goal to have full employment. Today, the only goal of the ECB is to keep the inflation below 2%. And even if we don't have yet a direct policy of the ETUC, we are discussing whether this inflation target isn't too low, that it would probably be more optimal to have an inflation target around maybe 2 to 3%. Because what has also happened during the crisis is that wages have become more flexible downwards, particularly in the south. And that means that if there is a new crisis, wages will respond much more quickly than they did in the past. And to protect us from that, it would be better to have a little bit higher inflation target than we have today. It's also important that the ECB can act as a lender of last resort, so that we know that the ECB is really guaranteeing the debt of the member countries. And finally, also that even if we agree that the central bank should be independent, it doesn't mean that the central bank can interfere in politics by actually telling governments what to do. And this has been the case in the Troika, but also a few years ago, the letter to the Italian government where the ECB explained that if the government carried out a number of labour market reforms, they would buy debt, Italian debt, and that is just unacceptable behavior, I think, for the European Central Bank. So there are a number of things to do, and we also need to strengthen collective bargaining, rebuild social dialogue, not least in Greece, where there are a number of efforts already taking place through the ILO, and a lot is being done to improve collective bargaining. So I think it's improving slowly, but this will take a long time because a lot has actually been destroyed during these years, and it will take a long time for us to build it up again. But I think I will stop there. Those are a few of our ideas, what we can do to change the current economic framework, the current economic governance, and I'm also happy to come back to other issues after the discussion.
Thank you, Veronica. Before I open it up, I would just remind you that in the mid-'70s, a guy by the name of Paul Volcker, who was the head of the U.S. Federal Reserve, announced to the world that he would no longer concern himself with full employment, that he would only concern himself with fighting inflation, and every chairman thereafter followed that same policy until Janet Yellen, the new Federal Reserve Chairman, has now said she has two jobs, as the law requires, finding full employment and fighting inflation. So if you do push for an American-style system, make sure that both sides of the equation are mandatory, or you'll end up with exactly what you have right now. Let me open it up to my colleagues for any questions or comments that you may have.
Ola Peterson, Chief Economist, Swedish Trade Union Confederation. A question to Professor Galbraith. Why should Greece not leave the euro?
Why should Greece not leave? The government was elected on a platform supported by, on a position supported by a large majority of the Greek people, which was and is to remain in the euro. And so its policy commitments is to attempt to seek an accommodation with the European institutions. And its approach has been to present the institutions with reasoned argument on the points on which they have differences of policy in the hopes that those arguments might prevail. So far, that hasn't been successful. A judgment about what to do next, what to do if this process does not succeed, is a judgment that will have to be made at that time. And it's going to be very difficult, a very difficult judgment to make. Prime Minister Tsipras yesterday, in his article, the headline is "Non à une Europe à deux vitesses." That's the headline. So they're in principle opposed to measures that, it's a Europeanist policy, a party, and it's opposed to measures that would, let's say, disrupt the fabric of the European Union. It is possible that Greece will be forced into a position where alternatives like that will have to be considered. But that's not something that the Greek government is going to do while there is any hope of avoiding it by the kinds of policy changes and accommodations that they're requesting.
So, Jamie, let me follow up to both of you. So, a European country can't use currency because of the euro. They've limited the amount of debt that they can incur, or they should incur, so they can't do stimulus. What's left for a government to do to spur growth other than labor and structural changes? What's left to them?
The broad strategy of the Greek government, to the extent that in the time it's been in office, it's able to develop a strategy, because most of its time is taken up with negotiations, has been the following. You set a reasonable fiscal target. You bring in resources with, first of all, tax reform. It's got it's a tax system which, let's say, charitably could stand some improvement. There are a few. It's been known in Greece that there are a few wealthy people who've actually been evading their taxes.
Well, we don't experience
that. We don't experience that in any other country, but admittedly, so this is going on. But you bring in some resources, and then you have some, let's say, some margin of maneuver to expand activity. This is not going to be a fast process because it's deeply constrained by the debt, by the primary surplus targets, and by the capacity to reform the system. But it's not zero. It's not nothing. What you need to do if you want more than that is to change the policy of Europe so that at the level where there is the capacity to act in order to improve conditions, to improve employment, to improve wages, to improve infrastructure, you put the resources in play at that level. And the difficulty, of course, is that Europe is a very, let's say, immobile entity with, so far as we can tell, a limited capacity to reconsider its economic position.
Veronica, do you want to comment?
I think it's precisely because of your question that the EU governments are thinking about what more they can do, and that's why we have this note I mentioned from the 4 presidents, where they are thinking of creating some kind of fiscal capacity for the EU area. Because if you have a joint currency, normally you should also have a joint financial policies, which is not entirely the case today. So we expect that there could be a proposal in June for a limited EU budget, for example, to add up to the national unemployment benefits. So you could have some kind of system at EU level, but this is still very unclear, but there are discussions going in that direction, and also then something that the ETUC would have to look into much more closely. But there is also the difficulty of having any fiscal capacity without changing the treaty. And there is a lot of resistance, for example, in France to change the treaty. And it's not something that will happen anytime soon. So the question is also, can the EU have more joint fiscal policy without changing the treaty? So there are a number of issues that will be discussed. And also this idea of having some kind of transfer union, which is the same as having some kind of joint unemployment benefit. But I think that you mentioned also taxation, which is an important area, not only for Greece, and that's also why one of our demands is for the financial transaction tax. And every time we believe that those 11 countries that have gone ahead with this enhanced cooperation procedure, every time we believe that now there is an agreement, we will finally get the FTT, which was scheduled for the 1st of January next year. And again, we are disappointed, and still we are waiting for this final decision, which might come in June if we are lucky, who knows. But that's also an important instrument that could be used, because that would bring more revenue, and even if that is not the first priority because it's really to deal with financial speculation, but nevertheless it would bring very much needed revenue to governments.
Back to this question of central banks that you raised a minute ago. It's an important question, particularly for the American case is, I think, important for non-American audience to understand. The Federal Reserve was created, 1913, as a so-called independent agency. And that word has sort of morphed into this notion of independent central bank. But an independent agency in the United States government has got independence from the executive It's not part of the cabinet. The chairman does not serve at the pleasure of the president. But it is not independent of the rest of the government. And in particular, it is not independent of the United States Congress. The Federal Reserve is a creature of Congress. It is a statutory agency operating pursuant to laws written by a parliament, by the Congress. In this respect, what happened in Europe was very different and institutionally quite unique. The establishment of a central bank that is free of any checks and balances. I started my career on the staff of the Banking Committee in the House of Representatives, and we had Chairman Volcker, his predecessor, Chairman Burns, up every 6 months or more frequently to answer whatever questions we wished to pose. And we posed very extensive questions. And we had the capacity to write resolutions of the Congress, I wrote a couple of them, that were in principle binding on the Federal Reserve. And the reason the Federal Reserve has that dual mandate, full employment and reasonable price stability is the actual language, is that it was written into a statute in 1978. The statute was drafted in 76 by two congressmen, Augustus Hawkins of Los Angeles and Henry Royce of Wisconsin, which was the congressman I worked for. And I was on that drafting committee. So in some respects, that language is, well, they gave it, nobody thought the Federal Reserve was that important in those days. So it fell to a 24-year-old staff guy to draft up the language that pertained to the Federal Reserve, and that happened to be me. But in any event, the failure to place the central bank in Europe under a system of accountability, of true responsiveness to elected officials, is what gets you into these abusive situations that you described, where the central bank can write to a government and demand substantive policy reforms and not have the representatives of that government call it to account in a parliamentary setting, which is clearly what happened in any situation which was more normally constructed, in which the central bank is considered not to be a deus ex machina, something completely outside the control of human agency, but a normal human institution subject to the rules that govern everybody else in a constitutional system.
Rudy?
Thank you, Chair. I fully agree with this last explanation of Professor Galbraith. A second problem for the European Central Bank is that there is not a statute that is saying that a goal would be full employment. They have only the objective of fighting inflation, which is a huge problem since years in the macroeconomic dialogue. They have only one goal or objective to realize that it's fighting inflation. And as there is no inflation, what's the goal of the ECB at this moment? But nevertheless, that's one point. But I would come back. I would like to come back on the possible Grexit. I think you've used certainly, and I agree too, the political argument with the democratic election in Greece, but it's also a point of, for my opinion, but that's the question to you, that a Grexit would cause instability in the long term, but which would the next country? Spain again, Ireland. Secondly, I think that would be a decision that would cause enormously inequality in Europe for all these people in this situation. But my question is then too, is there not a huge problem in trade union membership that have we enough political support of our members to more solidarity and to explain for the public opinion that we need this solidarity, because if not, we will create more inequality, more instability, and at the end, less economic growth everywhere in Europe, finally. But because it begins in Greece, and which would the next, and after that, and after that. because it looks like a punishment for this progressive and democratic elected government.
Responses on both points. On the question of central banking, that, without going over the same territory, there's another issue associated with having a single, highly dogmatic goal for the central bank, which is that it prevents the central bankers from speaking honestly about what they're doing. In the American context, with a broad mandate and a number of different things, and actually if you read the statute, it's quite expansive, the central banker can afford to be somewhat candid about their role, which includes saving the financial system from crises, right? Which is something the European Central Bank and the Federal Reserve Bank were both engaged in doing. But the European Central Bank, because of the monotone character of its charter, can't really speak to that in a candid way. And a bank which can't speak honestly can't be held accountable in an honest way. So there's a deep problem of the integrity of institutions when you allow an ideology which is already out of date by 30 years, which basically monetarism, something which nobody talks about anymore as an idea, because the notion that controlling the money supply controls the inflation rate has fallen out of fashion and out of statistical reality for decades. When you allow that to be the framing of a public institution, then you're going to run into this kind of difficulty. And it's not an insignificant question just on that ground alone. Then on your second point, I think it's clear that if one country exits the euro, that will change the course of history. It will set a precedent, and depending on what happens, other countries will very likely exit as well. So that you're setting off a chain of events which you may not wish to set off. Instability in the short run is a very significant risk. Whether in the long run you're more stable or less stable than you are now, I think is objectively unclear. The current situation in Southern Europe is, for many parts of the population of that part of Europe, and for Greece in particular, intolerable. It is not sustainable. It will be dealt with by people leaving the country, as they are already doing, if it is not dealt with by changing the policies that affect people in the country, because people are not going to stay there if there's no jobs and no incomes and no capacity to live. They will go elsewhere if they can. That's the first solution that will happen. It's small countries, it happens all the time. It's the history of Ireland, right? It's the history of Portugal. It's a significant part of the history of Greece. It's the history of large parts of Italy. So this will happen one way, changes will happen one way or another. The only question is whether policymakers will make those changes into something that's sensible and in the spirit of the construction of the European project. Okay? Whether in the long run you're worse off, that's, I think, an open question. I have a colleague from Poland, and my understanding is that that Poland is not particularly anxious to come into the euro. Thank you very much. I think that's correct. So it's not obvious that if you're part of the European Union, a member of NATO, fully integrated in every respect, but not a member of the currency zone. The UK. Well, yes, there's the UK. Yes. The U. Well, still you, I guess, but only. Yeah, right. In effect, right. But I choose the example of our colleague from Poland because I can see him across the room. So new arrangements can be arrived at. And if they are arrived at in an intelligent way, they might work out. But it's the short-term instability, the threat of throwing people into poverty, the threat of disruption that is, and the fact that in the Greek case, that the Greek people are clearly Europeanists and they would like to remain in the euro very strongly. That is what is governing this decision now.
Very good. Yes.
My question is, what is a sustainable governance for the euro in Europe, given the political constraints we faced with, because our people want to get nations, but within nations it is not possible to get one European governance for the euro. So how can we find a solution?
That's not fair.
On the contrary, it's only chivalrous.
Well, that is the issue we're all battling with. Of course, it's very, very difficult, and that's why, I mean, the points I tried to make before, those are some steps that would improve the situation if we would get the recognition from EU member states that that is the policies that we need to pursue. But it's clearly it's very difficult, and it's not just the economic area, it's also the social area where we're seeing more and more divergences. Now, unfortunately, this panel before, if our other colleague would have been able to come, he would have spoken more about the UK situation. I mean, it's not only that we have the Grexit, we also have the Brexit. And what would that mean for the workers of the European Union, where we have the fear that the UK would try to renegotiate the employment and social legislation which has been put in place, which is also a threat to us. So I think there are a number of very, very difficult issues, and I'm afraid I don't really have the good answers to this. I can just repeat what I said before. I mean, those measures that we have already agreed upon within the ETUC are really important to change things, and we need to get better understanding from EU member states and the Commission, and that's where we have failed. It's like we've said before, I mean, the OECD has done this excellent report on increasing inequalities, but why is that then not transformed into changed policies? Why don't the policies change? Why is it the same policies again and again? And as I said before, I think it has a lot to do with there is so little space. We have nailed ourselves in a corner. Even governments don't have any space anymore. They have to abide by the rules that they have agreed upon. So you have to change the rules. But changing the rules is not an easy task, and it's not something that is going to happen quickly. It will take a very long time before we have come there, but we will have to.
Let me offer an intermediate thought here. We have a situation where for 5 years, 6 years, the economic governance of the European Union, and particularly the Eurozone, has basically offered one formula. Right? And that formula, you can argue about whether it worked anywhere, but it clearly did not work in certain places. And it's a reasonable thing to argue that what the Greek people did in basically defeating their entire previous political system and replacing it with a party of newcomers who had never held power before. Never in the post-war history of Greece had this coalition of parties come to power. They did something quite profound and definitive. They didn't just replace one governing party with another governing party. They said, we need some new approach. And part of that approach was animated by a coherent, logical, economic alternative, one that was not crazy, one you can read. It's basically the work of Yanis Varoufakis. So what Europe needs to do, what I would think as a non-European, is to work out a way in which there can be diversity of policy on the part of member countries, and preferably within the Eurozone, in which it's possible to say, no, we don't have all the answers. We, the institutions, are not omnipotent. We didn't decide, get everything correct in graduate school, which is essentially where these ideas come from. But we are going to respect the ability of member governments and the willingness of member governments to follow a different path and to change policies. Right? The model I would give you is China. One country, two systems. Right? They haven't taken over Taiwan. You have ideological flexibility. Right? At least that's the point of view of Beijing. So I would like Europe to have at least as much ideological flexibility as we observe in China. Would that be a standard, you suppose, Mr. Chairman?
Yeah.
And then when you have that for a while, you can start working on larger. If you go to change all the treaties at once, you're not going to succeed.
So long as you add in the U.S., because austerity wasn't just a creature of Europe. Remember the Washington Consensus, the IMF, the WTO, and the large dose of neoliberalism that the United States exported to the rest of the world. So much of the undoing comes back to us as well.
That's true. It's American graduate schools, I'm afraid, which is largely at fault.
John, you had a quick question.
I'm sorry, there's a lot of people want to ask a question, but just on this specific point, this is a kind of, it was going to be a one-hander, now it's two-handers, but I mean, the first point is Rich has just made, that we're kind of discussing Greece and Europe as if the 2008 crisis didn't happen. So it's, the issues around debt, it would be good to sort of reflect on, because I think, that hit different countries in Europe in different ways, but there was a more fundamental issue there, which I think this has shifted the whole discussion away from the way the Euro crisis has gone. But, I mean, the one-hander I was going to raise really in response to, the questions from Ola, from on it is really to pick your brains, Jamie. The political consensus in Europe on governance, I mean, it was assumed in the Eurozone, there was a consensus that de facto, if you had a single currency, you had common debt. And that's what financial markets believed up until 2010. But that clearly then unraveled, and a situation where you had a country, 4% of European GDP, has suddenly created now, or it's been part of an existential crisis, which is, may well end up in a complete unraveling of the Eurozone, and subsequently a set of political crises with the National Front in France and other countries, and Brexit and a whole series of things, into a pretty unpleasant situation that we might end up in. But all of the issues about governance, I mean, are there any lessons now? And I'm also thinking about, the way this has played out in the German discussion with the German finance minister. If there's not some return to some assumption as common debt, if you have a common currency, does institutional governance achieve anything? And if that's the situation, is not the risk that the actual conditions for entering into that discussion are just going to be much more austerity and control over debt, rather than what you were describing as, one system, sort of 28 countries or whatever it might be. I don't know, there's some inkling of how to work through that problem.
Well, to begin with, clearly what happened in 2008 was a general crisis of global financial system, credit markets. And what happens in that crisis, that situation, is that investors dump everything risky and buy everything solid. Right? The crisis originated in the United States, in the housing markets, in a wave of financial fraud, with instruments that had been rated AAA by American rating agencies, multinational rating agencies, and sold to international investors, particularly in Europe. And when all of this became clear, people were going to take massive losses. What did they do to protect themselves? They look at their portfolios and they dump everything that might lose value. So they dumped Greece, they dumped Ireland, they dumped Spain, they dumped Portugal, they dumped Italy, they bought Germany, Britain, France, and of course the United States, especially the United States. And there was actually a dollar shortage in spite of the fact that the crisis arose in the United States. We had to make loans to give people liquidity in dollars that they needed. Right? That's the mechanism. Since that time, the operation of these credit markets has been very much less than what it was before. And certainly none of the general mood of confidence and ebullience has returned. And a country like Greece, even though it got a massive restructuring in 2012, remains very much dependent upon politically negotiated loans. That's in part because its creditors, which were private banks, ostensibly private banks, became public entities in 2010, transfer of the debt from the private to the public sector. So it's now a problem which has to be resolved at some level by political institutions. And that is why, in our modest proposal, we suggested that the European Central Bank become the vehicle for relieving the debt costs of all of the peripheral countries of Europe that wish to participate by moving a fraction of their debt, the Maastricht-compliant portion, basically under the, let's say, credit worthiness, which is unassailable with the ECB. And that would have been a reasonable way to proceed. But yes, I suspect you can get a general climate of credit expansion at some point once you resolve the existing debt issues. That's been the case in Latin America, where you have crises and people come back into the markets after a certain period of years. The problem in Europe has been this blockage, which is an unwillingness to recognize that losses have been taken on the debts. So that people say Greece has 180% of its GDP in debt, even though a great deal of it has been restructured out to 30 or 40 years, and its present value is considerably less than that. Basically, that's an artifact of the condition of crisis, the Greek position with respect to the credit markets, rather than an artifact, of, if you like, of the actual present value of its debt burden.
Thanks. I'll make mine quick, because it's going to be gloomy. I want to pick up on the comments that Rich and that John were making. And that is part of the political problem is that citizens are blaming whoever was in power. So even if we can get France to elect a socialist, this current general failure means that now we're going to blame the socialist in France. So we're getting some instability just because no one is coming up with a solution. In the meantime, Europe is now confronting what the U.S. had to confront with people crossing the border at will. And Europe strikes me as less prepared to handle an influx of immigrants that they don't want. And that influx is landing in Italy and Greece, the two countries least prepared to handle it. And then the rest of Europe seems to say, well, it's still your problem anyway, because we don't want to even come to grips with a common way of resolving a European responsibility for this human tragedy that the world is watching. So we have the UK, which is responding with wanting to rewrite a social contract and saying we're going to put up borders. At the same time, we're dealing with this crisis. What is the silver lining here that doesn't make this a total train wreck, where having to deal with a fiscal crisis, political crisis in Greece, a humanitarian crisis and the folks coming over in boats, the retrenchment of an overconfident conservative government in the UK, and all of this strikes me as a train wreck. So where's the optimism?
I deny having expressed the slightest optimism. You know, late in the 1960 campaign, President Eisenhower was asked if he could name the accomplishments of Vice President Richard Nixon in his administration. And the president said, "Give me 2 weeks and I'll think of something."
Is that it?
You know, I'll just a comment on the first part of your question or remark, which had to do with the citizens blaming whoever is in power. You know, they're not always wrong. Very often, and recent examples are known to all of us, citizens vote for what they believe to be a program of real change, and what they get the day after the election is dramatically different. It's the return of the same bank-linked, financially entrenched advisors and the same stale and ineffective policies. And it's not surprising that the political parties, and particularly the socialist and social democratic parties of Europe and the Democratic Party in the United States, have suffered major fall in popularity. In Greece, the Socialist Party PASOK is practically extinct. Right? It's collapsed. But it's also, I think, interesting and revealing, because it hadn't happened before, that when you got a government which came in, even though it was a government that's really had no experience, it's full of amateurs, college professors, people like us, trade union activists, political activists, but a government that wasn't corrupt and that laid out its principles clearly, that government got a wave of support that has held up for 4 months in Greece. For 4 months, it has held up pretty well. But it was particularly high in early February when the negotiations got underway in Brussels. It reached 78.4%. Which point I said to one of my colleagues in the Greek delegation, when you're at 78.4%, you can afford to ignore the rounding, to ignore the first significant digit. It's all right. 78 is plenty, and you'll never see it again. But yes, that's a sign that if movements emerged, and remember that 4 or 5 years ago, the alternative in Greece was the Nazis. It was Golden Dawn. It wasn't Syriza. But if movements emerge which do articulate clearly an alternative policy, people will rally to them, and not just people who voted for them. At this point, a very large fraction of the people who voted against the Greek government are rallied in support of that government. So that's just an object lesson, I think, which has not been seen in Europe for quite some time, and not in the United States since, well, yes, you and I can go back into our childhood and find examples.
Please. Yeah, please, Veronica.
Thanks. No, just to add to the pessimism, I think there is one element which we haven't really discussed, and it's financial markets, because this crisis is a result of financial markets, and I don't think that in Europe we have resolved this problem yet. We have a weak banking union, which I'm not sure will fulfill the role that it was really intended to do. So that's also something to bear in mind, that there could very well be another crisis in the future. But to try to be more positive, you could also turn it around and say it's amazing that the Eurozone still exists. With all that has happened, it could have fallen apart a long time ago. But I think I want to really underline what you mentioned about the Syriza. We haven't seen yet what the final outcome is. If you read Financial Times today, they are again emphasizing the Brexit scenario, saying that it doesn't seem that the Prime Minister is so interested in finding an agreement, that he's not as upbeat as he was last week. But we still don't know. They might actually come to a solution, and it might be a success for the government. But I also want to just emphasize a few points where I think there is some room for scope, room for which we can influence. It is the investment program. There is finally investment taking place in Europe. They are setting up this fund to channel investment to countries in need. And I think this is something that we will have to make the most of. So there are positive signs in Europe as well. There is also the fact that the Commission is again and again emphasizing that we have to strengthen social dialogue, and they are looking into ways where to find a better role for social partners, both at European and national level, to participate, not least in the European semester. Now, again, our concern is that they want to channel this social dialogue into the European semester. Social dialogue should take place in a lot of different areas, not only the European semester. But at least there are things that we can exploit. There are positive elements out there. It's not all that dark. And there's also more recognition that wages, we need wages to increase in order to stimulate consumption, growth, and so on. And there's also now a bit more flexibility on behalf of the Commission in the application of the Growth and Stability Pact. We have seen it with France, for example. France has had a budget deficit bigger than the allowed 3% for a longer period. So, and there is also in the political discourse from the Commission, there is now more flexibility than there was before. There is also the whole process now of the review of economic governance, even if I don't believe that we are going to get through all the demands that we want. At least there is a review taking place, which is the opportunity for us to make our demands and show member states where the problems are, the problems that they need to address. So not everything is bad. There are also some good things happening.
Let me contradict the note of optimism that you just expressed. And on a particular point, which is the prospects right now for an agreement. I think it's important to recognize that what the Greek government did was exceptional in terms of tactics. They did not lay a negotiating position on the table from which they were prepared to retreat. They specified the lines that they wouldn't cross right from the beginning. They had to do with fire sale privatizations, pensions of already deeply stressed and impoverished elderly, and labor rights. Right? These are core principles on which the government cannot retreat and yet survive. And so it isn't going to retreat. As an example here, by the way, what you have here is the case of a left-wing government in a capitalist system negotiating the sale of a major facility, the port of Piraeus, to a right-wing corporation from a communist country, China, and insisting on labor rights that the Chinese corporation would otherwise not have wanted to respect. So this is an example of postmodern political orientation, if I've ever seen one. These are, getting back to the serious point, these are core commitments. What we find in the negotiations is that after the things which can be agreed to are agreed to, the institutions come back around to these core issues and insist on concessions. And it's apparent that part of the motivation for that is not economic but political. That what they want is to see the Greek government cross its own red lines in order to show who is really in charge in the process. Not in order to reach a rational agreement on negotiable points, but in order to establish a power relationship. And they, I think, have grossly underestimated the resilience and determination of the government to stick to what its declared principles are. So we are in much more closer to an August 1914 situation in which miscalculation and misestimation on the part of the institutions can lead to, quite soon perhaps, to a default on major payments. The consequences of that would then have to play out, but that's what we're looking at in the short run. That's not a secret, that's been in the press. And the notion that at the last minute, the Greek government is going to come in and sign on the dotted line in order to avoid that consequence strikes me as a major misjudgment, a historic misjudgment. And it's one that's complicated also by the fact that the central bank, European Central Bank, and the IMF appear to have different priorities and perceptions. One of them seems to be very much concerned with the power relationships, the other one's concerned with debt sustainability, and the two are not. So the ability to come to a solution is made even more difficult by the fact that the Europeans and the institutions in general, not all European, do not speak in these negotiations with a unified voice. It's not just the Greeks against the Troika, but elements of the Troika against each other. And the European Commission has been actually the most constructive, as I understand it, of the three, but also differences amongst those three parties. With time running out, I'm not betting on an agreement. I would be, in fact, pleasantly but quite surprised if there is an agreement that the cabinet in Athens can accept.
Yes, as academic people like you show, a solution for this Greek debt problem is it's not so difficult, making part of the debt perpetual as an element of it. Yet European leaders like the Germans or the German Minister of Finance keep saying we won't let pay the European taxpayers for this Greece debt. These are really populistic quotes that could be rejected. My question is, would bigger support of civil society, of unions and other organizations not be very helpful to counter or to give another voice raise another voice in Europe? Because now you see a play between the Greek government and these institutions, and everybody is standing aside and looking at this like it's a ping-pong match, but perhaps we should do more on this.
Absolutely. Thank you for saying that. It's extraordinarily important at this point that other voices be heard, because the government is quite isolated, as you say, and there's been a general detachment from this debate, which is perhaps natural as it goes on and people become a little bit weary of reading about it. But we are at an extraordinarily important moment, and it's a moment not just for the Greeks, but for everybody, I think, in Europe and, for that matter, in the wider world.
Chris?
Thanks very much. A question for Professor Galbraith, and your view as a non-European and American in particular, on the perspective and the role of the U.S. state in this process. Historically, a recent history that the American government has played a very central role in responding to financial crises and containing contagion. I'm thinking of Mexico in particular, but obviously other regional crises after that, and the 2008 financial crisis, in which the Federal Reserve played a fundamental role, and arguably the Treasury as well, in organizing creditors, and given the prospect of a disorderly exit and a renewed financial crisis and contagion, what is the U.S. state's position being? I'm thinking of the Treasury in particular, but the other components of the state, and what might it say about the capacity and the limits of the U.S. state to resolve or contribute to some kind of resolution that comes prior to a wholesale meltdown associated with a failure to arrive at an agreement and renewed panic in financial markets, and then does the U.S. role, its actual role and the limits on its role that it can play, also speak to the differences you pointed to a moment ago between the IMF, where the U.S. plays a particularly important role, and the other components of the Troika? So just the political angle from the American government's perspective.
Well, to begin with, I'm can tell you for sure that the U.S. government is watching the situation very carefully, and that's true at the Treasury, at the Federal Reserve, and in the administration proper. Probably the principal public statements have been made by Jack Lew, Treasury Secretary, who has on multiple occasions called for, the word he uses, a pragmatic resolution, which at least puts him and the Treasury, the U.S. government, on record as favoring flexibility on both sides, which from the Greek standpoint is quite constructive. The president has also been directly engaged, and that I know of a number of telephone calls to Chancellor Merkel, urging that she play the leadership role that she in fact has. And in particular because the U.S. is strategically concerned about the unity of Europe in the face of Ukraine and the relationship with, or the non-relationship with Russia. So these things are very much part of the American calculation. This is in part also on the other side why the Americans stepped in to squelch the idea that the Greeks should put a terminus of a Russian pipeline in Greece. There was a meeting actually at the one of the interesting features of the last fund bank meetings in Washington was that only one finance minister met with President Obama, and that was Yanis Varoufakis, who had a 12-minute discussion with him at the reception which the White House happened to hold on that particular day, an annual event on Greek Independence Day, on the 16th of April. So the U.S. is, quite engaged. One of the things that the president said, which I found extremely endearing when I heard of it, was he said, "I know austerity sucks." Yeah. Presidential remarks to remember. That one is certainly up there in that category. The position of the U.S. is very concerned that there not be a default, and that there not, why? And especially not to the IMF, because as you pointed out, the IMF is an institution that's very much under, there's a strong American presence, which is not true of the European Central Bank. So something that weakens the role of the IMF has an adverse effect on the U.S. interest as far as the United States administration sees it. And so they would like to see, if there is another rabbit that can be pulled out of a hat in order to make payments to the IMF, they would like to see that rabbit created. I don't think there is such a rabbit, but the fact is the last payment to the IMF was made out of a fund that was a bit of a surprise to the Greek government. It could be used for that purpose. Something that came in quite at the last minute. Whether the next payment will be made or not is an open question 4 days away. So those are some of the concerns the U.S. has. The U.S., as you say, does play and has played a strong stabilizing role. It did with Mexico. It did in the global crisis by extending swap lines to the European Central Bank and the Swiss Central Bank and elsewhere, also to Mexico and Korea. And so that power is there. And ultimately, since the global financial system does sort of depend upon a dollar, the stability of the dollar, you have to imagine that the U.S. is going to continue to hold that power in reserve if it's needed. But in this situation, I would imagine that they would very strongly prefer that this be handled in-house in Europe, because it's, after all, a European rather than a global issue, at least so far.
Yes.
Sorry, I just wanted to come back to the previous question, because I think it's really important what we can do to try to support our affiliates and the Greek people. And just to underline that what we have done so far has been in complete coordination with our Greek affiliates. And they, by the way, they want to stay in the Eurozone. They certainly don't advocate to leave the Eurozone. And I saw this morning I had an email, there is a new initiative call for European bottom-up mobilizations, Solidarity to Greece, 20 to 26th of June, which is signed by a number of local trade union leaders, but so far it hasn't been signed directly by the presidents of our affiliates, so it's something that we need to look into just to make sure that if we mobilize around this, if we try to support our affiliates, that this is what they want as well. But I do think that we have very little time to act, and then anything we can do to support them will be very important.
Stefan?
Ich möchte noch mal ganz kurz einige Sachen sagen, die durch die beiden Vorträge, glaube ich, auch noch mal deutlich geworden sind. Ich glaube, dass wir in Europa nicht nur unterschiedliche Entwicklungen haben, die hier beschrieben worden sind mit dem Süden, die Länder, die dort besonders betroffen sind, sondern wir haben auch eine Entwicklung, ich sage das mal für die Bundesrepublik Deutschland, wo wir warum geht das immer aus? Wo wir einen Finanzminister haben, der die Ist okay? Okay. Ja, ich will mal sagen, wir haben in der Bundesrepublik Deutschland einen Finanzminister, der die schwarze Null zu einem Fetisch erklärt hat. Der bei allen Sitzungen, die stattfinden, wo Menschen aus dem Finanzministerium dabei sitzen, gibt es immer die obligatorische Meldung, wo gesagt wird, ich möchte hier nur betonen, dass es für all das, was hier besprochen wird, kein Geld gibt. Und wir ja mittlerweile in der Bundesrepublik Deutschland auch eine Investitionsschwäche haben, die unserer Meinung nach die Zukunftsfähigkeit des Landes auch gefährdet. Und das, was in Deutschland gemacht wird, wird als Musterknabe beschrieben und wird den anderen übergestülpt. Und das ist etwas, wo wir als Gewerkschaften eine große Kritik dran haben. Deswegen haben wir ja auch vor 3 Jahren auch schon einen europäischen Marshallplan vorgelegt, der genau das vorsieht, was hier gesagt worden ist. Wir brauchen Investitionen in die Zukunft, und zwar in ganz Europa. Und da müssen alle Länder gleich betrachtet werden. Und es müssen auch in der politischen Entscheidung der einzelnen Länder sein, was mit dem Geld gemacht wird. Und diese Debatte kommt, glaube unserer Meinung nach in Europa so kurz. In der Bundesrepublik haben wir jetzt eine Fratscher-Kommission gehabt, die festgelegt hat, wie Zukunftsinvestitionen getätigt werden sollen. Aber auch da haben sich diejenigen versucht durchzusetzen, die vor allem auf private Projekte gesetzt haben und nicht die Möglichkeit auch eröffnen, bei den Verschuldungsspielräumen, die die Bundesrepublik Deutschland hat, zu sagen, wir greifen jetzt auf das billige Geld zurück, was wir am Markt eigentlich bekommen, die Bundesrepublik Deutschland. Und das ist eine große Kritik von uns. Und ich glaube, das zusammenzubringen, einmal das, was in der Bundesrepublik Deutschland im Moment als Fetisch, ich muss das so sagen, erhoben worden ist, nämlich die schwarze Null, und die Auswirkungen, die dies auch auf Europa hat, ich glaube, das muss man auch ein Stück weit gemeinsam diskutieren, weil diese Politik ja versucht wird, auch anderen überzustülpen mit einer Austeritätspolitik, die die Länder abwirkt. Und dass wir auch re-regulieren können, glaube ich, hat die Einführung des deutschen Mindestlohns gezeigt. 3,7 Millionen Menschen kriegen ab dem 1. Januar erheblich mehr Geld, zum Teil 3,50 € mehr in der Stunde. Und all das, was uns Ökonomen erzählt haben, wie zum Beispiel Hans-Werner Sinn, dass dadurch 1,2 Millionen Menschen zusätzlich arbeitslos werden in der Bundesrepublik Deutschland, stellt sich im Moment nicht ein, sondern die Arbeitslosenzahlen gehen zurück und der Konsum wächst. Das ist ja interessant und somit auch die Importe zum Teil für Konsumgüter. Und ich will das nur noch mal klar machen, dass wir dort in dieser Europafrage diese Diskussion vorantreiben müssen. Was wird gemacht an Investitionen, um Europa auch voranzubringen? Und was wird auch gemacht, um Griechenland im Euro zu halten? Wir haben kein Interesse daran, dass Griechenland die Eurozone verlässt. Auch wenn das manchmal von der politischen Bühne in der Bundesrepublik Deutschland einen anderen Anschein haben möge, dass man sagt, das ist jetzt beherrschbar. Der Brexit ist jetzt beherrschbar. Diese Debatte wird ja mittlerweile auch in der Bundesrepublik Deutschland geführt. Ich glaube, das hat Folgen, und Sie haben das zu Recht beschrieben. Was passiert dann mit den anderen Ländern? Sie haben Portugal genannt, Sie haben Frankreich genannt, Sie haben Italien genannt. Was kann dort ein Brexit auslösen? Welche Auswirkungen hat das insgesamt? Und dann würde das alles zerfallen, unserer Meinung nach.
Thank you for that. Is Herr Schäuble in the room? Was he listening? Would be very helpful. John, think you could get him in so that our colleague could repeat his questions?
Yeah, he couldn't make it.
I mean, precisely right. I do think that there are forces. I think the Chancellor is aware of the dangers of a breakup of the Eurozone. But I think there is an important question in the German government as to whether the Chancellery or the Finance Ministry is in control of events. And the forces inside the institutions that are, in some sense, on autopilot, have an agenda based upon false premises, are extremely strong in the short run. And unfortunately, it's the short run that's going to determine these things. If there is a calamity, an accident, it's probably going to happen in the next few weeks, or at least the start of an accident. So this is a situation where the dangers are very present and very urgent. I do want to say a word because I got your comment about the effect of the rising minimum wage as an example of there's a false economic analysis that is all around us. The reality is, of course, that a rise in the minimum wage has two effects. For an employer, it's an increase in costs. For the worker, it's an increase in income. And so it's an increase in spending power. And what the business loses above the line, it gets back in revenue. Comes in through the front door, what it pays out through the back. It's a redistribution in the society in favor of fairness and a more equal society. But there is no evidence that a high minimum wage is a bad thing for employment. There's no evidence from Australia. There's no evidence from the UK, where they introduced it recently, relatively recent times, of this. And I gather in the UK, the minimum wage has become basically uncontroversial because it was a success. And in the United States, we're moving, this is a very important movement now, with $15 has been, I thought I was being quite forward when I last appeared at the AFL-CIO and spoke fervently for a $12 minimum wage. And President Trump immediately raised the ante to 15 without batting an eyelid. And now $15 has been legislated in the city of Los Angeles, in the city of Seattle. And these things will set a precedent and a standard that will be followed up quite quickly around the country. And there's something else about particularly this policy, which is that if you set a low, relatively small increase or a low minimum wage, you only affect a few people. And not many people care. But if you set a high one or a big increase, in our case from $7 to $15, a really substantial increase, then you're reaching a lot of people. And if a lot of people are getting a raise, not just the person who's getting $8, but the person who's getting 14 also gets something, guess what? They like that. I've never, so far as I know, encountered a working person, or myself either, and as a professor, I don't claim to be a working person, who didn't like getting a raise. So from a political standpoint, it's very strong. It's very strong politically and very strong from the standpoint of an economic policy that can be legislated without making it into a big spending program by the government. So you aren't actually, you can turn to Herr Schäuble and say, it's not your bailiwick, it's not your jurisdiction.
I think now we're going to shift gears just a bit. John?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, just maybe as a sort of postscript on that conversation, on Wednesday morning at the Economic Outlook panel, which overlaps between the Ministerial and the Forum. I mean, Rich will be on a panel with Yanis Varoufakis, which is also moderated by Martin Wolf, who's from the Financial Times, whose views are pretty close to on this particular issue, from what I've heard, Jamie, to yours. So for those of you who will still be there, I think that's quite an important issue, but I think this has been helpful in preparing us all for that next discussion into the Ministerial Council. I just, for the last 15, 20 minutes, perhaps wanted to turn to Jamie and Veronica on the other part of the title of this conversation, which is inequality and the role of unions. And what you just said about minimum wages and how you set minimum wages, I think, gets us into that conversation. But perhaps I could just start with Jamie, but Veronica knows it very well from the discussions in Europe. I think the thinking has shifted in the OECD quite significantly now to see economically, not just socially, rising inequality. I mean, as a major economic threat. The last report that the OECD produced last week described it as a tipping point. The IMF, at least their research department analysis, has now identified decline of unionization as responsible for something like 50% of all of the increase in wage inequality in the last 30 years. If you go back a couple of years, the World Bank report on jobs and basically came to the conclusion that unions don't have really a negative effect on economic efficiency or job creation. But there seems to be this blockage of making the jump logically to say if inequality is a problem, unions are a big part of the solution, collective bargaining is a big part of the solution, there's not significant negative effects and other things. They're just not going there at the moment in terms of saying, okay, we need to change policies around collective bargaining unions and start encouraging those institutions to start moving so that in places where it's really difficult, we can start to do the job and you give the space. Now, if Robert Skidelsky had been able to make it, I was going to also ask him a bit about the historical context, because you've seen situations, certainly in the UK and States, where historically situations have shifted pretty quickly from seeing flexible wages and, let's say, weakening collective rights as part of a solution to seeing that as part of the problem, and governments have intervened. And in the UK, in the 30s and 20s, these were both conservative governments intervened to actually put floors under wages. So I suppose, Jamie, sort of to start with, picking on your, being outside the discussion, but looking at this very closely in your forthcoming book, how can we best strengthen our arguments in a way to win those arguments here, but also then politically to maybe have an agenda? And maybe Veronica might well want to comment. I was going to say, how do you join the Swedish model, or how do you become a Swedish model? But that's maybe not the right question. But how do you actually begin to look at some of the lasting features from the Nordic model, which still strong labour market institutions and centralised, or at least strong bargaining institutions, have been part of the solution? But it'd be good just to maybe.
Well, if I could steal some of my colleagues' thunder, maybe I'll begin with a little historic appreciation of the Nordic model. The Nordic model has a name. It's the LO model. Right? It's the Swedish Trade Union model. And it's associated with two Swedish economists, Meidner and Wren, with work published in 1951. And the principle of that argument was that if you have egalitarian structure of wages that is brought to you by a comprehensive collective bargaining agreement, that this has an effect on business. And the effect on business is to make it more difficult for bad business and easier for good business. Because the bad business relies on cheap cost, low labor costs, and a good business relies on high productivity. And if you maintain this discipline over time, the bad businesses are forced out, the good businesses are brought in, your productivity rises and your living standards rise. And it's not that Sweden became egalitarian because it was clever, or rich because it was clever. It became rich because it was egalitarian. And you have this dynamic over time that favors high productivity, a very open economy. Swedes were never protectionist. a very open economy with a strong labor base that brought you the heavy engineering and advanced industries that can work effectively with powerful unions. That's a mechanism. It's a very important mechanism, completely forgotten by the neoclassical economics, which simply looks at a cross supply and demand diagram and takes the completely outdated and long discredited UK Treasury view of 1929, which is that unemployment can only be the result of high wages, excessive high wages, and everything that has to be done is to lower wages in order to improve competitiveness. It's the opposite of how you actually improve competitiveness. It's the opposite of how competitiveness was improved in Japan in the post-war period. It's the absolute opposite. The Japanese unions ran a spring offensive every year. As they pushed up wages, they pushed up productivity. It's the opposite of how the American trade unions operated in their heyday. All right? And in 1952, so 1 year after Meidner and Wren, my father, John Kenneth Galbraith, published a book called American Capitalism, and the subtitle was the concept of countervailing power. Countervailing power is an idea that when you have an economy that is dominated by large institutions, big government, big corporations, you need to have well-organized civil society as a countervailing force, and the leading element in that is trade unions. And the challenge we face is that the core of what was historically the first to organize, say, industrial sector, has been eviscerated in our societies by forces of globalization, technical change, and various other things, policy, including Chairman Volcker in the late 1970s, early 1980s, in the U.S. And so we have to bring the same principles to bear in other sectors, in the public sector, in the services sector, in the sectors where, in the healthcare sector, in the education sector, in the sectors where jobs actually are, recognizing that a, let's say, relationship which is balanced between social forces is going to produce a better result than one in which one side is well organized and the other side isn't organized at all, which is a relationship that's only going to produce, or a situation that's only going to produce classic forms of exploitation. I think it's hard to make this argument. It is important, however, that the people who take positions of responsibility in decision-making organizations like the European Central Bank or the European Commission, the Federal Reserve or the agencies of the United States government, not be indoctrinated in an archaic, deeply biased, and completely discredited notion that somehow the only social force is one that works, or the social system that works is one which is entirely imaginary, in which there are nothing but completely atomized, separated, dissociated individuals, each competing furiously to stay afloat. That's not a society, That's not an organized society. That's just a form of social chaos. I yield the floor.
Thank you. Together with my Nordic colleagues, we have spent a few days in Denmark last week discussing the Nordic model and what we can do to strengthen and reinforce the model, so they might want to comment as well. Because, I mean, we still use the Nordic countries as a good example, but the problem is that the good example is getting less good all the time. One of the Norwegian think tanks, FAFO, has done quite some interesting studies, and I attended a presentation last year where they said that Sweden is actually among the Nordic countries doing less well on equalities than they used to do, and if the decline in equalities would continue, Sweden would soon, I think 2025, find itself at the same level as Italy. No offense to Italy. But the problem is that it's just going downwards. Instead of keeping the level or even doing better, it's doing worse. So how can we stop this evolution? And that's what we have been talking about. Of course, what is very, very important is to maintain the high organization degree that we have in the Nordic countries. And what was also interesting from the meeting we had last week was that we had one researcher who explained that actually the group which is less organized, or the age category which is least organized in the Nordic countries, are people which are among 35 and 49 years old. And I was a bit surprised because you tend to think that it's the youngest which are not organized, which would be quite normal because youth employment is so high. We have over 20% in Europe. But that's not true. So it's really, which is positive because it makes it easier for us. If the problem is in an older category of workers than the youngest, then we already have something to work upon. But I think that's the very important criteria for us to continue to try to grow. And here, the TCO affiliates have been successful in growing and recruiting new members. And they have, at ETUC, they have just received one more seat in our executive committee because they have come over an important threshold. So, I mean, there are some good examples of recruitment which we can use among ourselves to get inspiration from. And I think also, as John said, collective bargaining is of course part of the solution, and that's also why you have resistance in the Nordic countries against the European minimum wage. Even if there is a lot of understanding for the need of minimum wages in other countries, it's not what the Nordic unions would want in their own countries, because they still have bargaining power, and I think this is really crucial to keep the model, which is still lower inequalities than other countries. It really depends on collective bargaining, and as you have explained, that this is in Sweden the wages are quite compressed. There is not a big difference between the worker at the shop floor and the one who is higher up in the hierarchy. And that is one of the explanations for why we have quite an equal system compared to many other countries. So this is really work that we have started and that we will need to continue. I don't know if my Nordic colleagues, if you want to add something on what we do to fight inequalities.
More point, based on some work that I did some years ago with a colleague who's now here at the OECD, a student at the time, was looking at the relationship between equality in wages and unemployment. If the textbook view were right, the more equal societies would have more unemployment, and the less equal societies would have less. But when you look across Europe, where there are very distinct differentials, the exact opposite historically is true. In general, the lowest unemployment rates are in the north, and the highest ones are in the south, which exactly corresponds to the inequality. Now, why is that? Well, in part, it's for very simple reasons. If your wage structure is egalitarian, you don't have a lot of people leaving the relatively low-wage jobs in order to compete for the better ones, because everybody's pretty much on the same level. If there's a big difference, then of course people leave the farms and go to the cities. They leave the bad jobs and they apply for the good ones, and many of them stay unemployed because they're not enough. And that's the experience anybody who knows the south of Europe or the south of the United States knows this is the case. Right? It's the source of migration is differentials. It's true in China. It's a universal thing. The more inequality, the more unemployment, just for that reason alone.
So, yes.
Sorry, just one more point. What is also very important is the rate of the unemployment benefit, which has in the Nordic countries been relatively high. Now, unfortunately, in Sweden, it's not so high anymore because it was not changed for over 10 years, and that is also one of the promises of the trade union-led government that we have to increase the ceiling of the unemployment benefit. Now it's not that easy because it's a minority government, but that was one of their promises in the election campaign.
Okay, so one last question. You've been both of you have been very generous with your time. One last question. Given where we are all the stuff that we've talked about, what can we as TUAC and as trade unionists in our various centers do better to help remedy the situation or to make it better for workers?
I guess it's my turn to go first, right? Well, we do have the messages on our side, and we have the statistics to support us, but why are we not better in getting acceptance for our message? Why don't the politicians hear us? That is what is very difficult to understand. But I think it is, as I said before, it's the fact that there is no room for maneuver anymore. In Europe, governments have locked themselves into these rules, which they cannot really change. Well, they can, but that is a complicated process. So there isn't any scope for action anymore. There are little things that can be done and which we will emphasize, and we need to be much, much stronger, and also that we stay united, that we come with the same messages. For example, I could use TTIP as an example, because I think, although that is also an issue which is contentious within the ETUC, but I think the ETUC together with the AFL-CIO have been working very closely together, and I think that has been very helpful in order to get our message out there, because we have a strong transatlantic position, Europeans and Americans together. So I think that internationally, if we would all go for the same message and actually decide that this is the thing we should focus on the next few years, I think that would be really helpful to get better understanding for what we are saying.
I'm not sure I have a definitive answer to that question. But it does seem to me one thing that would be useful would be for this group and its affiliates to become visibly involved in the political battles that are going on in particular countries, where the trade union movement is engaged in a political struggle because of an election or, in general, a campaign of some kind. I think it would be very helpful if colleagues from nearby countries and other countries were present and helping to raise the saliency and legitimacy of the issues in these particular local national contexts. And why is that? Because the debate is dominated by foreign experts who are on the other side, who are taking the neoclassical, neoliberal position. And you don't hear too many who are on the union and the labor side. They tend to be the local, the nationals who are fighting their own battles in each place. And so I think more circulation, particularly in places where the struggles are going on, can help to shore up political movements that ultimately will be the deciding forces in each of these situations.
Good. For our part at the AFL-CIO, we are attempting to make raising wages the central issue for the next presidential election. In January of this year, we held a Raising Wages Summit, and we brought in academics, politicians, business people from all over the country, and said raising wages is a solution that needs to happen. And now we are having smaller raising wages summits in each one of the first 4 primary states, so that no matter what candidate comes in, they will have to talk about what they're going to do to raise wages and change the economic rules to let more than the top 1% succeed in the system. And the other thing, Jamie, as you well know, is we're forcing or pressuring every candidate to tell us who their economic advisors are. because the one thing we've learned is it doesn't matter who the president is. If you have the same economic advisors, you get the same economic result every single time. And so we're pressuring all of those candidates to do that, and we will continue to do so. Hopefully all of us can join in and work together on that. We're going to come back at a later time and talk about what we can do to be more effective at TUAC and what we can actually do to make the OECD a little more effective as well, if that's the course that we think is prudent. I just want to thank both of you. One, for the generous amount of time you've given us. Two, for the candor and the great answers that you gave us and the analysis. Let's give our speakers a tremendous round of applause.